Hiya folks, Carl James here from Electric Media Madness, joining me for another Strange Tales. Today I want to talk a little bit about the classic novel 1984, and to some degree I also want to talk about its author, George Orwell. Now, whilst 1984 has always been a classic piece of science fiction, it's always been a classic piece of literature in its own right, but one of the things that's happened in more recent years is that 1984 has become far more prescient, and it's one of those books that people really need to read at this point in time right now. But for this video I want to talk a little bit about the path that 1984 took from its literary form into broadcast format and how it was broadcast on the BBC, the reaction to it. There are some connections between George Orwell and the BBC which I'm going to get into, and also a first mainstream broadcast of 1984 actually in America. Orwell's story of a dystopian future ruled over by an oligarchical dictatorship remains one of the most disturbing, best remembered examples from the science fiction genre. And it was just a few short years after publication, and incidentally after the death of George Orwell himself, that 1984 gained some mainstream notoriety. Ironically, it actually gained its notoriety through the BBC. But there was a prior adaptation through broadcast, and it's the first mainstream television adaptation of Orwell's novel, broadcast in the United States by CBS on September the 21st, 1953. And it was produced as part of the Westinghouse Studio One series, which in itself had run for about 10 years through the 1940s and 1950s. And the producers had carried out several forays into the science fiction realm at that point already, including the effective rendering of the so-called, I shall say, panic that allegedly ensued following Orson Welles' The War of the Worlds. There's far more to that subject than people realise. If you want to check out my book Media Psyop, the 1938 War of the Worlds radio broadcast, I really go into the depths of that subject. It's not what people think it is actually, and this idea of a panic is not as cut and straightforward dried as people think it is. But incidentally, that play from Westinghouse Studio One, entitled The Night America Trembled, broadcast on the 9th of September 1957, became one of the top rated episodes of the play series. And I should point out as well that Westinghouse Electric Corporation was the principal sponsor of the play series at that point in time. And for those people who investigate alternative knowledge research like I do, they will recognise the Westinghouse Electric Corporation. It's notable in alternative knowledge research, not only because the Westinghouse story highlights the connection between George Westinghouse, Marconi, Nikola Tesla. The latter was a true pioneer of ultimately suppressed energy-based technology. It features in the global legacy, respectively, of the mind control and energy cover-ups as well. That's another area of people to get into if they wanted to. But Westinghouse largely function on Department of Defence contracts. So really, we've got Department of Defence money that was financing these plays on CBS for Westinghouse Studio One. And it should be noted that Westinghouse and the US broadcaster CBS were, for the longest time, effectively one and the same entity. So Department of Defence money coming into CBS at that point in time. Another thing I should point out there as well, General Electric and US broadcaster NBC, the same kind of situation there. It should be noted as well that the Westinghouse version of 1984, it's not considered entirely canon. Several narrative alterations, the changing of certain character names. The screenwriter of the piece was William Templeton, and he went on to write the 1956 version of 1984. Directed by Michael Anderson of Logan's Run fame. Bizarrely, production of the 1956 film version was overseen by the CIA supervised American Committee for Cultural Freedom. But let's get back to the BBC's version of 1984 now. One of the reasons why I wanted to bring up the BBC as well is because how the BBC began and its political affiliations. It's believed a lot of it came about because of Fabian Society, which essentially set up the Labour Party. So you have socialism and left-wing political ideology in the UK, which George Orwell was fervently involved with. There are some beliefs that George Orwell was involved with the Fabian Society. It's never been 100% confirmed, but he did have a lot of affiliations that were involved with the Fabian group. So you have these political ideologies, connections between what George Orwell believed in and also what the BBC is generally, for the most part, always believed in and always been its sort of position politically throughout the many years that it's existed in the UK. We had this BBC broadcast of 1984, the first fully realised, much more faithful BBC play broadcast in December 1954. And the adaptation was released thanks to the genre writer Nigel Kneale. Now, Nigel Kneale, very interesting, it was, I should say, a very interesting chap in terms of the kind of material that he'd written. Most notably, a lot of alternative knowledge researchers have looked at the Quatermass stories that he'd written. And a lot of people believe that Nigel Kneale was one of these people who was, to varying degrees, in the know. He was an observer of alternative knowledge, sort of what we call agenda mechanisms, the globalist agenda mechanisms that exist throughout the world, existed back then in the day when he was writing this kind of thing. And a good case for that can possibly be made. Look closely at the production. I mentioned about the themes and the narratives that are in Quatermass, especially the narrative allusions raised in Quatermass 2. In fact, Kneale tellingly wrote the second Quatermass soon after his adaptation of George Orwell's 1984. What's really interesting about the BBC version of the 1984 is the reaction from the public, and it was lively to say the least. There were a number of complaints that were lodged against the BBC, mostly allegedly concerned about the graphic nature of the broadcast of the play, the torture scenes from inside Room 101. And according to Nigel Kneale's biographer, Andy Murray, a 2013 BBC Radio 4 broadcast called Very British Dystopias, and this is what he had to say on the matter. It was broadcast live, and this was the tradition at the time, that having staged a production like this, you would repeat it, that is, completely restage it the following Thursday. Between Sunday night and Thursday, there was enormous furor, and there were an awful lot of letters written to the BBC denouncing it, and there was a question as to whether the repeat would actually go ahead. And I've often wondered, was it really the reaction to the graphic nature? Because there is graphic nature, even if you read it as a novel, it's portrayed in great description, what happens to some of the, what happens to Winston Smith in the novel. But I've often wondered if it was more to do with the themes. Certainly the graphic nature would have part of it, but it's the theme. It's very unsettling for people living in this sort of post-war scarcity society the UK was at the time, for a number of years after the war ended, the Second World War ended. And one of the things that's always been the case about 1984 is it's a cautionary tale. It's a message from history. Ironically, it's become something of a manual nowadays. It's become something of a for certain elite types throughout the world. It's a how-to. It's a guidebook in many respects nowadays, which is one of the reasons why I believe that people should read 1984 now more than ever. At this point in time, if you were ever to pick up one book and read it at the moment, the way you would recognise so many things, and maybe you could argue that it's an ultra extreme version of it in 1984. We've got the soft pedalled version of it at the moment. Certainly we've seen it in the world since certain events that we can't really talk about in a great deal on places like YouTube, and that the events since 2020 in the world. And also you've got some of the deeper, darker agendas behind the diversity and inclusion thing. And if you look at the cancel culture and the victim culture, and you look at social media, and you look at how people are fired up and they take things to the absolute extreme, way beyond a level of common sense and ability to sit down and talk to people, and that's just one example. That if you listen to some of the talking heads in the mainstream media as well and all that kind of thing, you're very much seeing a contemporary version of 2 Minutes Hate from 1984 played out in society. But what's interesting about 1984, the citizens of Oceania, they are railing against the enemy, that external unseen force, and not recognising that the true enemy is the tyrannical rulership that's controlling Oceania and controlling people's lives there, the masses' lives. And that's one of the things that is very prescient about 1984, because we see people in society today railing against all kinds of things, almost non-existent things, and yet very few people actually stop to recognise that there are external forces at work in the world. At a time when 1984 was written, people probably would have said the state. That is true, the state control is something we should be very, very concerned about. But in this day and age, states are puppets for far more external powerful organisations and entities, things like the World Economic Forum and the International Monetary Fund, and these corporate entities and Silicon Valley, and then you've got the financial investment things like Vanguard and BlackRock. They dictating policy, they dictating the conditions under which governments should operate in the world now, and most of the world. if you know, with this 2 minutes hate thing, it's not really should be directed at the state. It should be directed at those entities, and that's something that mirrors, I suppose, in many ways with 1984, is the misdirection of people's angst. But getting back to that period in time, World War II had ended, the British people were looking about themselves and they were imagining these flawed social concepts such as victorious pride and nation building and all that kind of thing. And instead what they saw was just continued rationing, there was conscription, there was a decayed infrastructure in the UK. But interestingly, going back to the aforementioned Radio 4 broadcast, very British dystopias, there was an interview featured in there from 1996 with Nigel Neal. I don't think it was irrational to feel fear at that time. There was a lot to be frightened of, and I think that's generally true. This idea that just because the war had ended that everything was all shiny and great and wonderful and rosy and all that kind of thing. No, it wasn't like that at all. As I often do with these videos, I want to get into the socio-political aspects of not so much 1984, because I think it's pretty apparent what's there in the book, but a lot more to do with George Orwell and how his material has been sort of appropriated for various means over the years. It's interesting at this point in time, you know, there have been a number of articles floating around on the internet talking about how if you quote 1984, or you point 1984 out as an example of something that should warn us about history, that there's an extremist attitude to you in terms of diversity and inclusion. They've said that people are privileged, and if they laud 1984, I think 1980, it doesn't matter about any of that. I think 1984 speaks for itself. It's a cautionary tale from history, albeit a fictional one, but it comes from a point in time where people were ruminating about all these kinds of things going on. So let's get into some of that. Let's get into George Orwell himself. Mentioned about the possibility of having Fabian affiliations. Orwell did have many left-wing friends, Anna M. Bevan and George Strauss. His 1938 essay, Why I Joined the Independent Labour Party, bearing in mind that the Independent Labour Party was set up by the Fabian Society, published in ILP-affiliated New Leader, George Orwell wrote, "For some years past I have managed to make the capitalist class pay me several pounds a week for writing books against capitalism. But I do not delude myself that this state of affairs is going to last forever. The only regime which in the long run will dare to permit freedom of speech is a socialist regime." That's interesting. The naivety of it all at the time, eh? He goes on, "If fascism triumphs, I am finished as a writer. That is to say, finished in my only effective capacity. That of itself would be sufficient reason for me joining a socialist party." That indicates some of the things that were going on there in terms of his belief systems, his political belief systems. In December 1940, Orwell wrote in the Tribune about his changed political view after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the outbreak of war, and he apparently left the ILP, the Independent Labour Party, at that point because of his opposition to the war. He declined this invitation from the Duchess of Atholl to speak to the British League for European Freedom. And he said, and this is taken from Sonia Orwell and Ian Angus, The Collected Essays, Journalism and Letters of George Orwell, Volume 4. "I belong to the left and I must work inside it as much as I hate Russian totalitarianism and its poisonous influence in this country." And he was talking about the UK. And this is where we get to the left-wing tendencies, we shall say. And people will argue with that, but I think it's pretty obvious that there's more of a socialist aspect to the BBC. So between 1941 and 1943, Orwell worked for the BBC, where he wrote propaganda, or as Wikipedia would put it, I will quote from them, "supervised cultural broadcasts to India to counter propaganda from the Nazi Germany designed to undermine imperial links." But let's face it, it was pro-UK war propaganda at that point. And it is interesting there because you have that association with the BBC, and that may well be what paid off for him in the long run, because 1984 was written in 1948. Curiously, 1984 was the centenary year of the Fabian Society. 1984 is popular amongst academia and literary circles, but it wasn't a widely circulated work, at least not initially, and it seems that the BBC's broadcast of the play was one of the big factors in changing that, was putting it out to a more widespread audience. Now, I mentioned before about the inherent messages in George Orwell's writing, and over the years it's been utilised for both positive and negative ends. And research into the notorious Operation Mockingbird shows how the CIA, the US Central Intelligence Agency, made huge strides in influencing and directing political global propaganda content in the mainstream media. And one of Mockingbird's tasks was to influence the production of commercial film, occasionally initiating some projects. And that was the case with the big screen animated version of George Orwell's Animal Farm. And the original novel contained a socialist standpoint. It was critical of communism and capitalism. But the film version was retooled to restrict the message exclusively to an anti-communist message. And according to Lawrence Zuckerman's 2000 New York Times article, How the Central Intelligence Agency Played Dirty Tricks with Our Culture, after his death in 1950, agents were dispatched by none other than E. Howard Hunt, later of Watergate fame, to buy the film rights to Animal Farm from his widow to make his message more overtly anti-communist. And if you want to read more on that subject, I highly recommend, there's a fascinating book by Daniel J. Lieb. It's Orwell Subverted the CIA and the Filming of Animal Farm. And that really gives quite a detailed account of that. One of the final things I want to bring up in this video here is it's worth mentioning that Orwell was a figure of interest to the British intelligence establishment as a result of his research for the novel The Road to Wigan Pier. And the UK Special Branch placed him under surveillance in 1936, and that continued for almost 12 years, 1 year before the publication of 1984. And British intelligence actually held files on Orwell for more than 20 years of his life, sporadically believing that he was actually a communist. He was a socialist, effectively. And researcher Jim Keith, he believed that Orwell actually was a British intelligence agent. So, fascinating man, fascinating book, 1984. Many of Orwell's works are fascinating reads and they're worth taking the time to read. But 1984, it was a warning. It was a cautionary tale, work of fiction. It wasn't meant to be reality. It wasn't a Noddy's guide to tyrannical authoritarianism across the world. Yes, 1984 has always been important. It's always been a revelation. It's always been prescient. But I do believe that it has become more timely in this age of censorship and control, and people's freedom of speech is being eroded day by day. It's diminishing at an absolute rate of knots now. People having their bank accounts closed because of their political ideology and where their money's coming from. People who speak out against things that have been covered up in various governments around the world. So they decide to investigate it, they decide to go out there, they decide to ask questions, they research it, they put that information out there, and then they get silenced, they get censored, or worse, as we've seen, people who believed in bodily autonomy after the events of 2020, and how people have just been slammed, berated, and just torn down to this level of subhuman for daring to defy certain official narratives and daring to believe in the right to choose and the right freedom of speech and that. And I think 1984, above and beyond most works of science fiction, above and beyond most works of literature, full stop, I would say, most works of fiction actually, it's one of these pieces of work that stands the test of time. It does warn us. It does give us an indication of where things could potentially go very, very quickly if we don't stand our ground and say, no, this has got to stop. If you haven't already, please read it. It's a great book. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please like, share, subscribe. People get sick of hearing all that kind of stuff on YouTube, but it really does make a difference. And if you're interested in my alternative knowledge research, you can check out my books available from Lulu Publishing and Amazon.com, the links for which are in the description to this video. And I will see you again very, very soon. Bye bye for now.